Thank you very much, mate. Well, it's nice to be here. It's only the second time I've been to Queen's, so it's nice to compare colleges, isn't it, and see what they've got. Just a bit more about me. My own teaching background. I've taught here on all levels of courses. I've taught on undergraduate, masters, PhD training, professional development ones, a PGCE for schools, primary teachers, and I also do quite a lot now, perhaps even more now, of CPD, of professional development sessions for school teachers and for school leaders. So my own background is in teaching, and I realised I felt surprisingly nervous today because I will be addressing people who are the same kind of teachers as me. So because I expect you already know a lot about teaching in a university, and the course is no doubt helping you consolidate your experience and make sense of it. So my own research has been largely on the process of teaching and learning and the role of language in it. I'm a kind of psycholinguist applied to the study of talking, the processes of teaching and learning mainly. And it's been mainly done in schools, almost entirely. And as you're probably aware, there's the amount of research done on teaching and learning processes in higher education is minuscule compared with the amount that's been done in schools. It's strange in a way that all the researchers are in universities and yet they've rarely done it on themselves or on their colleagues. So some of what I have to say is sort of extrapolation, and some of it is making sense from my own experience in relation to what I've found out in research. And I'm going to be talking from a sociocultural perspective, which is the perspective which is a form of constructivism, I suppose, because that's the one I found most useful for making sense of, especially of the role of language in the processes of teaching and learning. But I'm quite eclectic. I mean, I heard you, I know you were talking about behaviourism and constructivism. I'm quite happy to pinch ideas from anything if I find them useful. Behaviourism, systemic functional linguistics, philosophy, whatever. It's just a case of what helps you make sense of the process. And I found the sociocultural perspective particularly practically useful as well as interesting. So I'll say a bit about that. Well, for that perspective, we are, of course, indebted to this fella, Lev Vygotsky, who many of you, I assume, have heard of, who was a 19th century psychologist in the Soviet Union. That's him with his daughter Zhita. And one reason we put the picture like that is he was particularly interested in learning as a social process, and in his case, particularly interested in the relationship between teachers and learners, adults and children. And his work, as you perhaps know, was very interesting. It's treated as such in Russia, but then suppressed by Stalin, who preferred the psychology of Pavlov and his dogs, perhaps for obvious reasons, and not the sort of the stuff that Vygotsky was coming out with. And we only really rediscovered it when some American people started to translate his work in the middle part of the 20th century. So his ideas, he also died relatively young in his 30s of consumption of TB, and he didn't see a lot of his work through to fruition. So a lot of what happened then was people trying to see whether his claims or his theoretical ideas were right or not. He hadn't got the evidence, there wasn't the empirical evidence by him to back it up. And in child development studies, Piaget was the big name, who placed a lot less emphasis on interaction and on language and so on. They were contemporaries, exactly. So his work then was the substance of research in psychology and education to see whether his ideas stood up. And I'm pleased to say that in general terms they do. We've just finished a major ESRC project in the faculty, in which we've shown, essentially, I won't go into that today because it's based in primary schools, but essentially we've shown other aspects of what Vygotsky suggested are in fact empirically supported. So what did he really say? Well, he really, to put it crudely really, he said children are born into ways of using language, that people are born into dialogues. They don't just born into the world, they're born into a speaking and listening world, and people engage children with dialogues from the minute that they are born. So they're operating in the social plane right from the beginning, and that's the nature of human nature. So this is one of the things he suggested. And in other words, he said that the social plane shaped the was taken up on the psychological plane. And this was something Greek philosophers had suggested a long time ago, that language might shape thinking. And there was even some Greek philosophers that apparently carried out some sort of experiment where they walled up some peasant children in a cave from an early age and didn't let them hear anybody speak to see whether they still spoke Greek. I mean, you wouldn't get that past an ethics committee nowadays, would you really? But nevertheless, it was probably interesting. Anyway, they suggested that, but Vygotsky's idea was rather more profound, because he suggested it's not a one-way process. It's a spiral or a helix spinning off into the future, in which children, people, students, are immersed in ways of using language which shape their ways of thinking, but then they can put their ways of thinking into words and put them back into the ways of using language. And so what he suggested was this happens naturally. This is the nature of human development and of human learning and cognitive development. But also, education systems are a sort of specialised and meant to be an efficient version of this cycle. They're meant to make it happen well. And once the people in, the adults or the teachers, hear what the children are saying, or the students, our students, then they can say something new to them, and that feeds back into the students' way of thinking. So it goes on in this way. So it's kind of a helix spiralling off in the future. And I find that a very useful way of thinking of teaching and learning in that way. And you know, institutions such as the university are institutions which are meant to make that process work, and they're meant to help students use more sophisticated ways of using language to understand subjects and advance them. And so language really is at the heart, he suggested, in a way that Piaget and others didn't, behaviourists didn't particularly, for example, that language is at the heart of the process of developing human understanding, and that thinking and understanding and knowledge are really essentially social, in social ownership. I mean, in this very university, Newton was here, wasn't he? And he had the theory of gravity. But his ideas about gravity weren't science until he got at least one other person to understand what he was on about. Okay? It only becomes science when a community of people understand it. Locked into his head, it wasn't science. Okay? And it was once he'd made sense of it and a group of people, scientists, the community of physicists or whatever, could operate with those ideas, that we had something that is essentially, for any useful purposes in education, we can call human knowledge. Okay. So this all comes essentially from Vygotsky's own work. So if we think about it then, what the more modern way of thinking within sociocultural theory and psychology, and one of the readings I gave you, I'll go into this in a bit more detail, is that language essentially has evolved with our species as a tool for thinking collectively. And that's what we can do, which other species can't. You know, we can operate in that way. We can change what we do on the basis of our collective thinking. The bees have got a language, haven't they, which, you know, well known, where they waggle their wings and tell others where the nectar can be found. But bees can't come back to the hive in the evening. One of them say, you know, I actually don't think this is going very well. You know, I think the way we're doing it isn't probably the most efficient. Why don't we tomorrow, you go and do that, you go and do that, and we'll come back and talk about it. They haven't got that, their language isn't that kind of language. That's exactly what we can do that no other species can. And we do it better or worse, but that's what we do. And so that's what language really is. And when we use it as teachers, we're using it in a way to share and develop collective thinking and understanding. And in the Vygotskian sense then, the collective thinking shapes the way we think alone. That's what you want the students, that's what we want to get from this course, isn't it? That we all go out with new ideas that help us make sense of the world. And ideally that we're part of a community in which those ideas are part of the currency. It would help if our colleagues in the faculties could talk about what they're doing in the same words, in the same ways. That's a great thing about doing courses like this, which weren't available to me when I started. So this is one of the things we're trying to do as professionals, and it's one of the things we're trying to do with students. And what students need to happen, what needs to happen for students is that they need to be inducted into the specialist language, the discourse, if you like, of the subject, because, as Vygotsky said, language is both a cultural tool and a cognitive tool. They learn the discourse of whatever subject you teach, and it becomes a toolkit for them to think about things with, phenomena, in whatever area you're interested in. And I find that a useful way of thinking what we're trying to do. And as one science educator who I know in the States nicely put it, science education should make students fluent speakers of science. And you can see what he means, yeah? So does that make sense so far? I mean, interrupt me if there's anything you want to, but we'll have a chance, obviously, a bit later. So that's the sort of theoretical background, briefly expressed. So on now to the sort of stuff of it itself. It seems to me, and this isn't my own idea really, it comes from other people's work as well, that there are, if we really oversimplify for the sake of clarity, you can soon see this isn't nearly so neat as it looks, but if we just take this as a way of thinking about things, as a simplified model, there are these two kinds of talk basically happening functionally in universities, in the processes of teaching and learning subjects. And the first we can call authoritative monologue. It's an idea that Phil Scott at the University of Leeds came up with, in which he means, you know, an expert is telling people who aren't experts, who are novices, about something that they've chosen to learn about. Science, philosophy, medicine, whatever. And it's that kind of monologue has some obvious functions. One of them is it can provide some factual information. I mean, this is a form of it now, isn't it? And I hope I'm providing you with some factual information. It's not the only and probably the most efficient way of providing factual information in any detail. Readings are probably better for that, but it's one of the things I can do. And I can explain some concepts and processes in a way that isn't quite the same as reading them on the page. But the other thing I can do, which doesn't really apply so much here, perhaps, but if I'm teaching students who are studying for a degree in the subject I'm teaching, I'm modelling the subject discourse. I'm actually using the terms in ways that hopefully will resonate with their developing experience, so that they can sort of see that it isn't just jargon. It's actually, once you understand what the terms mean, it means you can save a lot of time by using these terms rather than going back to complicated, long-winded explanations every time. As long as there's a shared common knowledge, understanding of what these concepts and the relevant words mean. And the second kind is what we could call dialogue, and I heard people talking about that when you were summing up from your group discussions. And here we're talking about supervision, small groups, things like that, typically, seminars perhaps. And the function of these is meant to be, dialogue is, the whole point of dialogue is this two people, or more than two. It means you've got a two-way communication. That students are allowed to express their ideas and discuss problems and misunderstandings, and give them a chance to reason, using ideally the discourse of the subject as it's developing as a reasoning tool, and the methods that the subject's giving them for reasoning about phenomena, and give them practice, so they do become fluent speakers of science, not just fluent listeners to science. And also, it's the one place where you can provide personalised feedback. So these are some of the things that dialogue, situations that allow dialogue, can allow to happen in a way that the authoritative monologue of a lecture in similar situations can't. I heard when you were talking about, you know, the small groups and so on, that you were saying about how, and about lectures, about what they were for. And I think this is one of the things we need to think of in relation to these two kinds of ways of using talk in gross terms. What are they for? You know, what are we trying to do with them? You can adapt lectures, as somebody I heard suggested, by having microphones that go around and take questions. But you probably can't provide personalised feedback on ideas through that method. And you shouldn't be trying, really. It's not really the point. Somebody also, I heard, mention that in primary schools, quite right, they've got a class of 30, teachers with them all year. They can talk for a bit, and then they can hear some questions. They can wander around, talk to them. They can say, well, I was hearing some of you this morning. I'm going to say something different now. We don't have that luxury or that benefit of continuous time normally. Often I'm doing a lecture on a course that I'm not supervising on or doing small groups with. Sometimes I'm doing the small groups, and I'm not one of the lecturers. So you've not got that continuity. So we've got to think of other ways of achieving that are easier for primary teachers. They're harder for secondary teachers because they also have people who come and go a lot more, and they don't have the core class that follows them, and they can develop this shared understanding through a whole year. You know, people are coming in their lessons only on Tuesday afternoons or something. But we've got even more separation normally of the people and the students. So one of the things we've got to do is think how we actually put them together. And what we would say from a Vygotskian point of view is that both ways of using talk are important and potentially valuable. There have been fashions, haven't there, in universities and other education, that lectures are terrible. And when I worked at the Open University, we didn't put lectures on the TV, hardly at all, because at that point, by the time I got there, there was a strong ideology there that lectures were old-fashioned, and it was just the sage on the stage when you ought to be the guide on the side, you know, and you weren't meant to be this. And there's been fashions like this. But I think they're misguided. Different situations and different ways of using talk have their own benefits and their own functions, as long as we recognise that. And I think it's a case of thinking, are we developing a strategic balance between the two? It might not matter if we're the same individual who does the supervisions as does the lectures, but there's got to be some relation between the two. And this book, which I only got recently, it's only just come out, really, Rolls Northage and L.A. Chambers. Andy Northage, who I went out for a drink with last night, in fact, which is very useful. They've written this book, Successful University Teaching in Times of Diversity. He was Professor of Higher Education at the Open University. And they've got a nice... I'll put a quote up in a minute about lectures, but they've got a nice thing here about how you should use the balance between. They give a little example from an initial lecture for some first-year students on postmodernism, right? And this is what the lecturer said. Structurally, it was on... Oh, you'll be interested. It was on structuralism and on postmodernism. He was making the comment. Structuralism is accompanied by a belief in transcendent truths, unalterable, absolute, and universal. And it's those three things, if you like, which are being called into question. This universality, this homogeneity, this sameness, this inalterability, being called into question in our own day by postmodernism. OK. So though you've got the discourse being spoken by an expert, what were the reactions that they found the students were having when they went into the supervisions and tutorials to find out? Well, here's a typical response from one student. After the lecture on postmodernism, I felt depressed, and I wondered if I was cut out for university at all. I just didn't understand the word. However, the same student said, when the tutor in our sort of supervision group broke the ideas down on the whiteboard and explained what they meant in my kind of language, I really got it. We had a great discussion about how the movie The Matrix, which I loved, is an example of how postmodernism is in this time questioning the structures we take for granted. So you see, all wasn't lost by the lecture being somewhat obscure. I'm not sure. I think the lecture could be better anyway. but nevertheless, the balance was the important thing, because the students' misunderstandings were able to be revealed. Andy was saying last night he once did he's a psychologist like me, and he'd done a lecture, done a whole thing on causal and correlational, factors. Whether factors are, whether it's causation or it's just a correlation. And he said in this group, he said he got them to read a bit out loud, and they were all talking about casual factors. And he said, what are you saying, casual? They said, well, that's what it says, casual. And this whole group thought it said casual. And he said, it's causal. Causal? What kind of word's that? And he said it was only through that kind of situation that he was able to get past a ridiculously naive but, important issue. So I don't know if that rings true to you about the balance between the two things. Yeah? And I'll finish off talking about lectures, about the authoritative discourse. We could say what makes a good lecture. Well, that's a different talk entirely, isn't it? All these sort of things that I've put at the top of the list, but we won't go into those now. But what Northage and Co. suggest is where the lecture excels is that it does offer an opportunity to witness how academic argument works in real time for students. It's not a matter of covering the ground in a lecture, you do that using all the other things, but of demonstrating the discourse. And he carried out an interesting study one time through an OU summer school where the great sociologist Stuart Hall, who worked at the OU, some of you may have heard of, he did stuff on ethnic groups in Britain. He's died fairly recently. And he was a really, really interesting lecturer, very good. And there were people at the OU were questioning whether Stuart should be doing lectures at the summer school, because lectures, bloody hell, lectures, not really the thing. So Andy said they said, what are students learning from them? Probably nothing much. And they'd done some studies, some of his colleagues, showing that the students' remembering of facts from lectures was in fact not that great. But what he did was he interviewed students coming out of Stuart Hall's lecture, and these were people doing the foundation course, D101, of social science. And he said, it was the first lecture on sociology, and he said, what are you getting from this, And they didn't say things like, well, I now know what the class system is precisely. And they were coming out saying things like, wow, I think sociology is the best thing in the world. It's definitely on my agenda now. After hearing that, I can't wait to get involved with the course. And that's what they were getting from him, rather than the detail. So I think we've got to think very hard about what these different things do. So given the limited time I've got, I thought what I'd do now is move on to the other kind of discourse, the dialogue stuff, and think a bit more about that. And this relates to one of the readings which you've got from me anyway. And I've done quite a lot on group-based dialogue and problem-solving in groups, not just in children, but with adults as well, and the use of talk in that, so it relates to that. So switching to the other, if you like, the other main use of talk in universities. What do we expect of students in a supervision or a seminar, small group sort of work? Let's think of one where we're leading it. What do we expect of them? What would anybody say? Yeah.
Duration before the session.
Yeah, good point. Which you don't always get, I know. Yeah. What else?
Participation.
Yes, participation. That's what you'd expect, wouldn't you? Anything else? Yeah.
An openness to sharing views, hearing others' perspectives.
Very true, exactly. They're not there just as individuals. The whole point of having a few, and I always like having a small group rather than just an individual, because you do get that diversity of view.
Interest?
Yeah, interest. You'd hope so, wouldn't you? To be honest, here at Cambridge, I don't think we suffer too much from students with lack of interest. Talk to people some other places, it's not quite the same. But let's think of what we expect of them. Participation, openness, right? Willingness to share ideas, and so on. Now, in the research that I describe in one of the articles that got sent round, in which we interviewed Clara Perez and I, my student Clara Perez, and I interviewed, she did the interviews, with students from two of the traditional colleges here, unlike mine, Hughes Hall, here at Cambridge. And as I don't know if we've all had a chance to read it, probably not, but what we actually did was interview students from state schools who just arrived in Cambridge, and then, in fact, we interviewed them through their first year, and students from private schools. And the big contrast, the interesting contrast, came between, that included grammar schools, it included not very well-known private schools somewhere, and it included Eton, Harrow, and all those things. And the interesting stark contrast, which that paper does, I think, reveal, is between the state comprehensive students who've come to Cambridge and the public school, you know, the elite public school people who've been to St Paul's, Harrow, Eton, and so on. And this, I think, is crucial if we're thinking about what do we expect from students when we put them in groups to interact, especially with us and with each other. Let's look at what some of the students from different kinds of schools said. Bradley from a comprehensive school, I think it was from Hull, said, I was quite overwhelmed. I didn't like it here. I could never just go and see people, and I just formed this little cocoon in my room. That's what he did in his first term. And Leo said, they were just people I'd never met before, the other students, and I didn't really know how to interact with them. And they were really, really posh and southern, and I had nothing in common with them. And it made me think, like, what am I doing here? And Samuel said, everybody seems to know all these quotes from famous poets, or they'll say like these, they'll like reference some old book or something, and I'll just be completely clueless. And I felt like I couldn't follow conversations because of how the things they were talking about. So that's how they reacted. Here's a longer one from Helen, who was from a comprehensive school in North Wales, I think. They wanted me to be on the debating team and do all those things which I could have done, but I didn't. I don't know whether I couldn't do them because I wasn't feeling very well, or actually I didn't really want to do them. In supervisions, I would be asked something and kind of shut down almost, rather than try and think, well, actually, I do know something, or do I know something I could infer something out of to answer the question? I'd be a little bit like, I don't know what you're talking about. I think I was just scared. I was scared of what he was going to ask me. Okay, and these are the people who've got the top results in their state schools, often in schools where they've not had that much help, relatively speaking, if they're very lucky. But, you know, often in schools with large classes, often with limited teachers who are dedicated but overstretched. That's what they thought. For them, supervisions were terrifying. And the other ones, the quotes I've got, they say things like, I knew some of the guys, the other people that hadn't really read the books, and I had. And they talked for 10 minutes, and the tutor said, well, great. And I just couldn't open my mouth. And this is what they thought. These are very self-motivating, self-regulating students who've got through their A-levels, probably a lot through their own efforts, and yet they're faced with this. On the other hand, these guys from the elite schools, I think the school did quite a lot to prepare me for here, in a sense. That's what it's there for. So I was given mock interviews by various teachers who knew me very well, who knew how to challenge me, how to get me thinking in a sort of Oxbridge fashion. One of the other ones said, well, it was really easy. Well, the person from Hull, from the comprehensive, said, well, it was, you know, I just didn't, like you said, didn't speak to anybody the first term. One of the people from St Paul's said, well, it was great coming here, because on the first day I met 3 people from school on the corridor in the college, and my brother's on the floor upstairs. And he even said, that boy, he said, well, in fact, I don't know if it's, I've got it on here, I'll just see. But this one, Tom said, brings it down to language, doesn't it? I speak with a home counties accent, with an RP, effectively, accent. Whatever I say, people automatically, I think, no matter who you are, almost in the world, I think, people acknowledge the accent. It's associated with authority. And therefore, I can often get away with saying things that I have no backing with whatsoever. But people just go, oh, well, you said it quite well. And this is what they think. This is really how they think. One of those students, just to compare it, the student from Hull said he was the first student he thought who'd ever come to Cambridge from his school ever. He thought there was a girl a few years earlier who had gone to Oxford, and that was all he could think of. One of the public schoolers said, well, I'm a bit ashamed to admit this, but on my UCAS form, I only put Cambridge. I didn't bother filling in the other ones, because I just knew I'd get in. All my teachers came from Cambridge or Oxford, and they said, you'll have no problem. And they didn't. It's like Toby Young, isn't it? 2 B's and a C and a phone call from his dad, and he got into Oxford. So, you know, there's a world of difference between people's expectations and when they come in. But there's also a massive difference in their skills. We're down to language again. What ways of language have they been inducted into in their schools, in their homes? How have those ways of language shaped their ways of thinking, but also their ways of expressing ideas? We unlike the bees, who kind of have the instinctive language hardwired into their brains, we just have a capability for learning it. It doesn't mean it's already there. So if you've not had any experience of operating in giving presentations like this, or working in a group, or demonstrating your ideas, or arguing with an expert or a teacher, how can you be expected to know how to do it when you get here? It's not the case. And I have to say that this university doesn't do an awful lot. It claims it wants to improve diversity, and it's doing a lot of effort, making a lot of effort. Some colleges, especially, my own's doing pretty well in getting a wider range of people from social background, but then we're a mature students' college, so it's kind of easier. But when the state school students come in and the public school students come in especially these traditional colleges, it's just assumed they've all had the background that the public school students have had, that they all know how to debate, that they all know how to work together or to express ideas confidently anyway. Working together isn't necessarily one thing the public schools know. But they do know, they have a confidence, like that guy says, about how to speak it. No, I'm not overgeneralising. I'm just saying it's not something that's systematically seen as an important part of students' arrival, from what I can find out. And there hasn't been my senior tutor at my college has sent round that article, and there's a version of it that's a kind of more popular version. And he's had a resounding silence from other senior tutors in the university about what's being done about this kind of inducting students into the discourses of supervisions and making presentations and things like that. Now, I don't think it's very hard to do something about that. From what we've done, certainly in schools, and what's happening now more and more in schools, despite the government's relative lack of interest in developing students' spoken language or oracy skills, we actually do know what you can do about it in many ways. And I'll just focus again on the notion of how to help people work and solve problems together. There are 2 concepts which are both essentially sociocultural, which I think are useful for understanding this kind of situation. And it really is useful, I think, to apply these concepts after we've just had a brief discussion about this. Say you had 4 or 5 students in a group, and you were, as part of a course, and you came out saying, well, that was a really good discussion today, thank goodness. What would you be hearing? What would have happened that told you it was a good discussion? What actual language things would you have noticed? Or when you saw it, yeah, go on.
I think this connects, I said that preparation was an important part, and preparation should be clearly outlined
Yeah.
in the session. And I think it's using the language, using the terms, showing that they've developed an understanding of theory from what they've already read, or at least they're helping to negotiate it with each other. So it's very focused on
Yeah,
the
it's
content.
so focused on the subject. Quite right, it should be. What else? What would you know about the dynamics of the interactions that would tell you it was a good discussion? This doesn't just apply in a supervision. Say it was a staff meeting, you know, what's a good discussion? But let's, you know, yeah.
You'd want to see respect for the views of others, but at the same time,
Yeah.
you wouldn't want to just accept what everybody says without challenging it.
Great. You expect respect for the views of others. These are really crucial, I think. But you would want challenges, because the aim of the group isn't just to be nice. It's to actually, you know, say they're trying to solve a problem that they've been set together. It's to get the best answer, isn't it? Or to, you know, those are really, yeah.
And a chance also for the less dominant ones to express their views.
Yeah, so it's not just a case of the one who knows it all speaking all the time and the others never, or the one from the public schools doing all the talking. Yeah, yeah.
I think you expect to see comments building on each other,
Yeah.
rather than everyone stating what they know, but to see a process of increasing understanding.
Exactly. You would expect to see some progress through time of the common knowledge and the understanding of the people. That's really good, yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
I want to see some disagreement.
Yeah.
I hate discussions where everybody agrees with everything.
Yeah, yeah. I agree. In fact, if they all agree, you've probably set the wrong topic, which is another factor that affects how good, you know, group work is. OK, these are right. I mean, I agree with all of those. Sorry, you got something else?
I was just going to say that for me, I prefer it when it's not kind of I talk to someone, bounce back to me like that.
Yeah.
That's the common kind of class scenario.
Yes.
It's better when it's flowing around.
That's right.
Without that kind
That's
of back
right.
and forth. That's a good discussion.
I agree. Well, you see, these are, and if you ask the students themselves, I think they'd come up with all of those same things. What was it? Well, was it a good discussion? So if you think about those, then right, what those discussions depend on, we can convert what you've just said into, in relation to this concept of ground rules. Okay, it depends on people using the ground rules. Ground rules, it's as I say, it's a social psychological concept taken from sport, really. What it means is the implicit, non-stated, but important norms which operate in any situation. And every situation that involves language has ground rules. Now, today, I was told I was coming to give a lecture of a kind, and it's going pretty smoothly so far, whether you find it interesting or not, but in terms of normative basis, it's going pretty smoothly, because you're following the ground rules, which are, you expect me to do all the talking, but I suddenly just sat down and said, right, that, you know, you think, well, it's not all. If you do want to ask something, you put your hand up, right? If I want you to respond, I say that to that. You probably leave any long questions to the end. If you look at your mobile phone, you do it very surreptitiously down here, so it doesn't look like you do it. Yeah. And you don't begin speaking in parallel with me. Stand up. You could perhaps give a more interesting talk now, but the point is you'd be breaking the ground rules. Now, when you came in, we didn't give them out to you. Here are the ground rules, because we know you know them, and we assume that. And the same applies to every situation. A job interview. Imagine you go on to a job interview, and they say, well, why do you want this job at Cambridge University? And you said, well, before I say that, tell me why you wanted your jobs. Now, that's a perfectly reasonable question in a way, but everybody would either laugh in a hollow way or be... because they were breaking the ground rules. The ground rule in an interview is you answer the questions, you don't ask them until the very end. The ground rule is at the very end. And have you any questions you'd like to ask us? It all runs, everything runs with ground rules. Now, in a small group, what people are doing are not necessarily using the right ground rules. They're using ground rules like, I don't know much about this, so I won't say anything. If you don't know much about something, don't say anything. Or, if you know a lot about a subject, just talk all the time. Or, I'll only agree with people because I don't want to be thought nasty. Or, I want to show that I'm a good speaker, so I'll just speak anything. Or, I'll only side with people who I think are my friends. This is the sort of thing you hear kids saying when you ask them. And those don't really end up getting the right solutions. You don't get healthy disagreement. And also, if you just say what you think and then you wait till the next person, you're not really getting anywhere, as you quite said. So what needs to happen is the things you need that you said need to happen in a good discussion need to be converted into ground rules. Everyone's involved, people listen attentively, people provide reasons for their views. Ideas can be channeled in questions respectfully, exactly what you said, more or less, isn't it? People are asked to elaborate, explain, and think aloud. If you don't know what somebody means or you're not sure, say, can you say that again? Or can you explain what you mean? And the group seeks to reach an agreement. You don't say, oh, we'll just agree to differ. If you've got to work together in a team and come up with something, you've got to agree, come to an agreement. And if you do, our research we've done with school students has shown if you get a group to say, if you tell them they've got to reach an agreement, like with the thing you did before, and you say you've got to end up with an agreed answer about what you think about behaviourism, you find people just go that bit extra mile. If one of you's got to stand up and say, our group thinks. Well, if you say, we'll agree to differ, yeah, you just leave it half finished. And what we found was this, when you went back 6 months later, it's the students being told they had to reach an agreement who remembered what they'd learned because they had to actually go that bit further with it. So these are the sort of rules, the kind of things that you can convert into ground rules that should replace the bad ones that people are using. And when you do, we get what we call exploratory talk. Now, exploratory talk, we found, is not only good for solving problems and for learning in schools and universities, it's good in lots of situations. In the research I did with Karen Littleton, what we said was we found when people use exploratory talk, they're not just interacting, they're interthinking. They're thinking collectively in the Vygotskyan sort of sense. And it's in this book, in fact, in which we talk about it. And in that book, what we did was we didn't just look at children working in groups. We looked at students working together. We looked at musicians rehearsing together. We looked at designers in studios designing things together. We looked at, not always ourselves, but sometimes we used other people's research to do that. We looked at research that had been done on government committees and how good and bad decisions were made. And what it came down to most of the time was things like that work well if they're using exploratory talk or a version of it. And there's other kinds of talk, like the kind that you mentioned, where people simply speak which we call cumulative talk, in which you do get an increased knowledge because you've said it and you've said it and you've said it, but it doesn't go anywhere. There's no building. So this is the sort of talk that's dynamite in all kinds of useful practical situations, working in labs, in science faculties and so on. People designing the new iPhone. But it's the sort of thing students need to be able to do. Now, many students will come here not necessarily knowing how to use this kind of talk because they've not been taught to do so. They haven't learnt to do so. Perhaps it's never happened much at their school. Even at the public schools, there's a lot more emphasis on the presentational stuff than really listening and working with people. So I think if we want the group part of it, the dialogue bit of the balance to work, I'm afraid we've got little choice but to train our students to do it. We can't expect them. To give them chance to work in groups isn't enough, and it'll often be a waste of time. What you've got to do is get them as aware of how exploratory talk works as we are, and get them to see themselves that it works better when they follow these rules. And I think that's absolutely crucial. And this is how we've done it in the faculty, and I do it with, as I say, with teachers do it in schools. You can take it through these stages. First of all, you need the awareness raising that we've done in a small way of what makes a good and a bad discussion. And pick out the most important features. And typically, the kind of people we get as students here, they're pretty bright, aren't they? They'll come up with the right things. That doesn't mean they were doing them. People who know, are bright don't necessarily do exploratory talk when they should. I've sat through some staff meetings in which people weren't using that stuff. They had other agendas and other ground rules. And then you convert these into a set of ground rules and you say, well, let's operate in this way. And then, of course, another whole workshop issue, what's a well-designed group tasks and how does that, make it work? Because that can make or break whether it's worth doing small group work. But this is what I think is absolutely crucial for us if we want students to participate well in the dialogue in the balance between authoritative discourse, the lectures, and the dialogue of supervisions and smaller groups. And I think if we do that, I think we're actually doing them a service in other ways, because, you know, what can a society expect of its graduates? There's a lot of this, but I don't want to get... I'm not one of the people who thinks that universities should be converted into job training factories and that's all they're for, which I know some of the government would like to think of. But I do think there's an expectation that graduates should have a certain set of skills. And these are the sort of things that the employers certainly say they want from their graduates. And it's commonly what employers say they're not getting. They're not getting people who are already good at working in teams, who can make clear presentations to customers or other people and so on, and work well with others to solve problems. And so there's a world of work which demands this kind of stuff and will help them. And there's also, you know, society as a whole. If people have a voice, then perhaps we don't have to go on being run indefinitely by the public school boys. So I think there is an expectation. My expectation is that I think that universities should take on this role, because we're not, at the moment, there are hardly any schools really doing this kind of training through to sixth form at all. There are some, and it's great, but there's not enough. So that's really all I was going to say. Just to sum up then, I think from this perspective, it's useful to think of language as a tool for co-constructing knowledge, not just transmitting it. So ignore anything Steven Pinker says, because it's just rubbish. Because he seems to think of language as this tool for transmitting precise nuggets of knowledge. I'd like to see him make a teacher in a primary class can tell 20 children exactly the same thing, and they'll go away and do at least 10 or 15 different things. Students need to be inducted into the language of the subject that you're teaching, because they've got to become fluent speakers of philosophy, science, or whatever. And that effective teaching needs this balance if we're going to achieve that and help them to learn actively, and yet also be given access to hearing the discourse spoken by an expert. And that we can't expect them all to be able to work in small groups or to stand up and make good presentations, because the schools won't all have prepared them to do that. And we may have to teach them how to do some of these things on the way to helping them become, you know, educated, fully university-educated people. So that's it. If you want to know any more about what I've talked about online, I'm the director of Oracy Cambridge now, and that's our website, and that's my email. And we also have a website which has a lot of stuff, mainly to do with schools, but has quite a bit of stuff about the things I've been mentioning, practical kind of info as well. So thanks for following the ground rules and giving me your attention. And I'm happy now to talk about any of it. Thank you.